All right, good evening, or good afternoon. Feels like evening for some of you out there. National Guard are America's treasure. Again, thank you for having me here. Final hour of the final day after an evening of state and regional celebrations. What a prime speaking slot they gave to me. But for all of you still hanging in there with eyes open, I appreciate it. But what happens to a treasure when it is squandered or neglected or buried, forgotten? It is lost. And that's exactly why you all have this organization, our National Guard Association and your Adjutants General Association, fighting each and every day to ensure our national treasure is not squandered through poor legislation or poor decisions at the national level that risk our National Guards of the 54. Here's what I'm going to do. I'll briefly highlight our 5 top priorities that we have set as your Adjutants General Association and delve a little bit deeper into 2 of them that we are currently heavily engaged in. 3 priorities that we continue to work hard. Full-time manning levels. You may have heard General Hokanson talk about that this morning. Our full-time manning levels need to be commensurate with the readiness demands that our Army and our Air Force are placing upon our National Guard. Recruiting and retention to meet our end strength targets, and ensuring that our Guard remains the combat reserve for the Army and the Air Force. I'll move on to the next 2. Duty status reform. The coined phrase as it was rolled out to us, duty status reform, and the presentations we initially heard from the Department of the Defense sounded great. Has a nice ring to it. Equating those benefits, regardless of component, when called out of state status. Many of us sat in on the January 29th Council of Governors meeting in which our commanders-in-chief were assured that there was no degradation in this language of their authorities over the National Guard in their states, and no attempt to change the Insurrection Act, you know, that troublesome little bit of law that limits what the active duty can place into our state without governor permission. The Department of Defense was marching along with 900 pages of legislation without having shown it to the NGAUS team. National Guard Bureau was represented by a major, sitting in with the full DoD team of experts, trying to ensure that the document met the needs of the 54. When your NGAUS team finally got their hands on the proposed legislation, we found that, in fact, the Insurrection Act language had been removed and governor's authorities were greatly diminished. Listen, equating benefits does not require, will not require degradation of our governor's Title 32 authorities. Had you not had professional organizations committed to protecting the National Guard, our treasure as we know it, deep and profoundly negative changes would have ensued. Our Army National Guard would have found the Army able to mobilize our soldiers as individuals rather than unit-based mobilizations. The President could have ordered active duty troops into your state without consulting first with your governor. The language, as initially written, would have fundamentally changed our National Guard in ways that we would be at risk to recover from. Legislation has stopped. It has stopped until it reads as we need it to read. Equal benefits without degradation of our national treasure. But who had to stop the bill from going to Capitol Hill as originally written? It was not DoD, it was not National Guard Bureau, it was your professional organizations of NGAUS, NGAUS, and NGAUS. Our second top priority involves National Guard imperatives. If you look back at the last 10 years, there have been repeated attempts within the Department of Defense and Capitol Hill to negatively change the National Guard as we've known it to exist over the last 382 years. You've heard this week about sections 1036, 1037, and 1038 of the Senate version of the NDAA for 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a critical point here. Let me highlight those sections for a minute and what it will do to our national treasure. 1036. Currently, our Army and Air Force have inspection authority over our states. As tags, we welcome that oversight and work to ensure the federal requirements are met within our states. 1036 would create an inspection team within the National Guard Bureau. Here's how I lay it out to our congressional staffers. We are manned and we are equipped by the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. We go to war with the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force. So who should have inspection authority over the states? The U.S. Army and the United States Air Force. Not a bureau, created and authorized as a channel of communication between the states and the Pentagon and Capitol Hill. They are not a command organization. They are a bureau with well-intended Guard men and women from our states, but who should not aim to be a command element over our National Guard of the 54. We ain't done. 1037. Let me read a few of those sections, and I applaud the captain who stood up and asked our chief of the National Guard Bureau that question. So 1037. If, within a time fixed by the President, an officer of the National Guard fails to comply with federal law or policy applicable to the National Guard, the President may bar the officer from receiving federal funds or withdraw the officer's federal recognition under Section 323 of this title. Also, within a time fixed by the President, a unit of the National Guard fails to comply with federal law or policy applicable to the National Guard, the President may bar the unit from receiving federal funds or withdraw the unit's federal recognition. Before taking final action, the President shall simply notify the Committees on Armed Services of the Senate and the House of Representatives of such final action. And that power, vested with the President, is delegable to the Secretary of Defense, okay? So, President delegates to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense is able to withdraw FedRec from an officer, FedRec from a unit, withdraw federal funds from that state, and only has to notify Congress of the action taken. Does not have to seek permission of Congress. 1038, the final section, frankly, to this officer is insane. It fully removes the authority of the governor to nominate the property and fiscal officer for a state, requires that any U.S. PFO cannot have worked within the state for the previous 3 years, and builds a brick wall around the entire PFO organization within a state, placing that entire organization under the National Guard Bureau. Do you all think that that language came from Capitol Hill? No, it came from the National Guard Bureau, our channel of communication to Capitol Hill. And I'm forced to ask, does that language benefit the soldiers and airmen of our states, territories, and the District of Columbia, or does it simply serve to move National Guard Bureau into a position of greater control over our states? Look around this room. Are we organized by NGB regions? No, we are organized by the states, territories, and District of Columbia, and that's the way we should remain. As professional organizations representing our National Guard, we have to get ahead of these destructive proposals and restore our Guard to its status as the combat reserve of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force, with independent foundations within the 54 states, territories, and District of Columbia. We cannot let a few who don't respect what we represent change us to what they believe we should be. I appreciate, again, and applaud the captain who stood and asked General Lengel for his thoughts on these sections. Unfortunately, sitting up here, I was unable to hear his response. So we as a body have got to get in front of these destructive legislative items that would result in a weakened National Guard, a weakened national treasure. I'll end with my personal thanks to each and every one of you, my thanks to your families for lending you to our National Guard, and my personal thanks for what you have volunteered to do for our states, territories, district, and nation. May God bless each and every one of you, and may God continue to bless our incredible United States of America. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.